I'm going to get to the other question we have, but I think I'll maybe get to that via a more personal angle, which you can feel free to answer any way you want, or you can go into your analysis of structures. But this is around, I guess, the NGOisation of resistance, and one of the things that I've been actually frustrated on your behalf, maybe more than yourself. I think you've kind of taken it as part of the struggle, but I've been very kind of exhausted and really I don't know, kind of frustrated, for want of a better word, at how lots of people are jumping on the reparations bandwagon and not connecting to the work that you are part of, that lineage, and they're not linking in with the work that you do, that they're not taking the time to find out about that work. Also, related to the climate justice work, I think we've had lots of fanfare around climate justice activists. There's reports produced with listing 100 activists, yourself, Mamadi, and people that don't make those lists who we know are working on the grassroots and in those. We've also attempted to work on funding applications to quite a few so-called grassroots. You're laughing, but that was traumatic. Applying several times to these funds, which are specifically for people who can't get funds elsewhere. And I know that you're not in it for money, you're not in it for the acclaim, you're not in it to make a name. But I guess it's still frustrating. Again, I'm going to come back to that word, that you are doing this work largely unsupported by these structures, and people are picking up the reparations name and managing to get funding, managing to do work which is not as embedded, not as grounded and rooted, and continuing that historical work that you're standing on the shoulders of. So yeah, if you could speak to how you keep going when all this is happening, but also what you see as some of the organizations, you're maybe some of the issues that you've seen in working with some of the organizations who are getting and who are seen as doing the work, aren't necessarily connecting.
Thank you. Really powerful question, important. I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability. So the challenges are huge, and you're right. I believe there is a deliberate and concerted effort to engage in what some of us in the movement refer to as ISMAR-denial, and that is denial of the international social movement for African reparations. Now, that denial is sometimes done by people who are of African heritage, and sometimes it's done by people who are non-African, of other heritages, okay? But also non-white heritages, and some white or so-called Caucasian European people as well. And this is a phenomenon that we've recognized, in terms of a lot of the scholarship, even the reporting. And I think there are many reasons for it. But one of the reasons that is key is, and I have to put it in the mix here, is anti-Blackness, but the specific form of anti-Blackness known as Afriphobia. So traditionally, a lot of these groups, and I don't need to mention them, but one or two might come up, who are taking up reparations now. Let's just be very clear. When you often hear about reparations, although yes, now that people are talking about climate reparations and reparations for all kinds of groups, I think the seminal struggle that people identify with reparations is the struggle of people of African heritage, however they self-define, whether it's Black people or what have you. And it's often said as being reparations for slavery. That's how it's often framed, because that was the foundational root of a lot of the interconnected dispossessions, if we recognize that African people are mothers and fathers of human civilization. So it is the foundational reparation struggle, actually. And a lot of the energy and the persistence of this movement that is known as the International Social Movement for African Reparations, which is intergenerational. In the UK, my own PhD research in history that I'm struggling to finish because of all the activism I do, is about the history of the international social movement in the UK. It goes back to the mid-1700s, and every generation of people of African heritage in the UK since has been championing reparations. One of the famous ones was Otobo Kugwano, who in 1797 raised the issue of restitution. Remember, the international law framework recognizes restitution as being important for African enslaved people. Okay, so there's a huge denialism about this movement and the ideas, the strategies for change, the vision of transformation that we have. And a lot of why I think that is happening is because even though we recognize like racism in terms of whiteness, you know, against the rest of the world, what we don't explore enough is the tensions between specific non-white groups and the hierarchy of race that basically puts black, you know, at the bottom, brown in the middle, white on the top. Okay, so even the notion of black and brown people, that never used to be the case. There used to be this recognition of blackness, or even a notion of political blackness, which I know has been criticized even from many African heritage communities. So what we've seen is the denial. So even though the energy of what is attracting people, including outside of these African heritage communities, is the struggle being waged by African people, whether in Abya or Africa or the Caribbean or other parts of the world. Because when people think about indigenous people, they often frame the conversation in terms of sovereignty. Aboriginal people refer to sovereignty. They might not use the term reparations, but African people also use the term sovereignty and reparations together. So that is something that needs to be recognized, but it's not. And despite the energy, so a lot of the work that I do, 99.9.9.9% is unpaid and has been for 20 years. How do I survive? Because I live in my mother's house. I'm actually 2 years, well, how old am I? I'm nearly 50, okay, in terms of my age. But I live in my mother's house. I started this activism at 28, 48, and have lost jobs because of it in terms of the politics of reparations. So there's been real struggle. And then at a certain point, you are just deemed to be too radical. When I started out 20 years ago, the first job that I lost was working for an organization of Black lawyers, okay? Because then to be considered, to be a reparationist 20 years ago was the equivalent to being classified as a Black identity extremist today, okay? So even Black folk would say, no, that's a bit too radical. It's a bit too extreme. It's a bit too unrealizable. And that happened to me. Okay, so had it not been for my mother and my father, then I just would not be able. So I have nothing for myself. I don't have a property of my own. I don't drive a car of my own. I live in a home, and my family have supported me. Yeah, so I live like a historical abolitionist in terms of have gone or been privileged despite that to go all around the world, but that's because people have resourced those trips. We'd like you to come and speak with us, engage with us, educate us about reparations. How do we share? And that's how I've got to travel. I mean, I haven't traveled so much in the last couple of years, but that is the impact. And most people that I work with, it's the same thing. So when we see a movement that we have sustained, helped popularize, sacrificed for, struggled for, been demonized for, persecuted for, but yet that has created capital social and cultural capital that others can now apply for funding actually to do work in this issue. That is the NGOisation of reparations that many of us resist, and we resist it because we want to stay honest. We want to stay true to our communities, because this is not about Esther or Kofi or anyone else getting a few consultancies or getting a little funding to do a little project with a local university. This is about people's lives, millions of lives. And the nature of capitalism and racial capitalism is that it only ever allows economic advancement for a few, not the many. That's the system that we're dealing with. And to truly kind of stop the harm and ensure guarantees of non-repetition from a reparations standpoint would involve, abolishing capitalism. That's what it would entail, which is obviously not an overnight thing. Yeah, so it's a long haul struggle that we have to engage in here. But I think the root of why this is happening is because of Afriphobia. Let me say it very clear. I think that especially in this society where, it used to be BAM, BAME, okay? Now the terminology that gets used is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And a lot of these terminologies actually end up perpetrating erasure of Africanness. And some of us refuse to be erased. And we don't want to come under the leadership and domination of other people that are non-white. We don't want to exchange one colonizer for another. And we are proud and assertive in our Africanness, because we know what it means to be African and human. We know what it means to people the planet. We know what it means to have our bloodlines through all of the human family. And we are not giving that up, okay? We are not giving that up. And that is threatening, because others want to speak for us, appropriate our voice, our agency, our creativity, in order that they can then do what white people have done. And that is the simple way that I can explain it, whether people like it or not. That has been my experience, and I've got the battle scars to prove it. And there are structures here that some of us, it's actually one of the questions. Could Esther say a bit more about the ways in which XR can be a dangerous and harmful environment for people of colour? What are the reasons to work with a climate group like XR rather than people of colour-led group like Wretched of the Earth? To say that some of us, as PARCO members and also members of the Global African People's Parliament, were involved with Wretched of the Earth in the early days, participated in the Wretched of the Earth block in the People's Climate March in 2016, and are no longer involved because of the same Afriphobia that I've spoken about. That is what we've experienced. And even though you might have African heritage activists, there's also a big fear of Pan-Africanism when that gets elevated. So if I am an African heritage, say LGBTIQ activist, it's not as problematic as if I'm asserting myself as an African heritage Pan-African activist as the key struggle that I'm elevating, irrespective of what my sexual orientation is, okay? Irrespective of what that is. So there is a resistance and a fear of, it used to be said as a fear of a black planet, but there's a fear of African heritage agency and thought, and the ability to be self-naming, self-defining, self-determining. There is a fear. And with Wretched of the Earth, many people who've become involved since have kind of tried to facilitate these connections, but that has not happened because some of us know the platform on which we stand and know, how certain perspectives that we shared were minimized, marginalized, and so forth. And so that's not a safe space for some of us either. No disrespect to anyone in Wretched of the Earth or any POC kind of formulations, but as I've already said, in terms of the work that we do via XR, which comes to the first part of the question, why would we do it? I've already explained why in terms of the work that we're doing. This is not work that we've been supported to do by Wretched of the Earth or Friends of the Earth or any of the supporting white-led structures that sort of support Wretched of the Earth. We're doing this work on our own terms with our people. And as I've said, these networks we have are affinity networks. The communities, and we're talking about huge communities, thousands and thousands of people, and in some cases millions. If we look at the Indian farmers' strike, Sumana, our coordinator in India, has been part of that. That's what we're supporting, that resistance on the ground, okay? Now that work is being supported by XR, not because all these farmers are XR members. No, we've said they cannot be. XR must recognize that these are pre-existing movements of rebellion that you need to learn from here in Europe and around the world where you have XR chapters. Now you have you have an XR India, you have an XR Africa, but those are totally separate to what we do, because our communities are not giving up their autonomy, they're not giving up their agency, they're not giving up their voice to comply or conform to XR. And in terms of what makes it dangerous, in terms of the notion of safety, racial or cultural safety, and the way in which activists that we work with have not felt, at home in generic XR spaces, which is why we created XRISN, the Internationalist Solidarity Network, and why we have a physical space, a home. It's not an office, it's a home, because we wanted a home away from home for our people. So we can stay there as long as we like. We can cook our food. We can have meetings around our culture. We can play the music we want. We can engage in the way that is going to edify our spirit.
Beautiful.
That's the reason why.
Real talk. Esther, that was amazing. We knew you'd bring the fire. Thank you for speaking so honestly on all those issues and taking us there. Obviously, like we say, there's so much more Esther can bring. There's lots of Esther's talks on various subjects, like I say, on YouTube. We're going to be engaging with you on many issues, continuing these issues of climate justice, of reparations, intertwining the two, the Pempanzie, the stitching together. We're going to be obviously making progress with the Leeds Declaration as well. And you've inspired us all. You keep inspiring us. Rest assured also that, as you give, and you always sign off with your servant. Another common thing which I resist is the kind of queens and kings thing. I know
Yeah.
you see yourself more as a servant, which I,
Yeah.
we're all kings and queens at all. And I respect you for the sacrifice, and like I say, rest assured it is valued by so many of us. You've given so many people who I'm sure you don't even know so much fire to continue this fight, and we salute you.